You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. Joining me on today's show is Tom Crisp. Tom has been cave diving since 2010 and has been hooked ever since. Working closely with the New Zealand caving community, he's been involved in several existing projects before establishing a small team and launching expeditions of his own across New Zealand's South Island. The team has had great success in extending existing sites and locating new ones to dive and are constantly looking for new projects. Tom has been involved in several other notable projects, including Project Middle Earth to Blue Creek Resurgence with the GUE New Zealand team, and he assisted the Wet Mules, now world famous through their involvement in the Thai cave rescue, that's Richard, Harry Harris and Craig Challen, at the Pierce Resurgence for their recent push dives to a staggering 228 metres in 6-degree water. In 2016, Tom moved to Canada, where he soon became involved with the Alberta Speleological Society, who took him under their wing. The ASS has had many projects underway and even more new ones are in the pipeline. When Tom isn't cave diving, he's researching or planning the next trip, whether it's on home turf and here in New Zealand or overseas. Tom, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here, and happy birthday for today.
Thanks very much. So yes, here on November 9th in beautiful Coopers Beach in the far north. And before we get started, I want to spend a little bit of time just setting up how Tom and I know each other, because it's super interesting. I returned from overseas from working at Gozo Technical in late 2016 and went into Global Dive in Auckland, one of the best tech diving centres in New Zealand. Met Andrew Simpson, who's a great guy and a very good technical diver and instructor, and started to talk to him about teaching sidemount diving in New Zealand and going through my background and so on. And he asked me, he said, "Do you know Tom Crisp?" And at that point, I actually hadn't heard of you, I'm embarrassed to say. And I'd been overseas for quite a long time. So he told me about you and what you'd done and that you'd moved overseas. And it was pretty clear right from the beginning I had a hard act to follow. So I had a bit of time I had to spend, I guess, earning my stripes to catch up to where you were when you left. So great to meet you after all of this time. I think we've been Facebook friends for a while now and we've known of each other, but to meet in person. And just another point, this is the very first in-person interview that I've been able to do. So really pleased to be able to do that with you, Tom. So again, welcome.
Yeah, well, it's great to be up here, and I think the story's fairly similar as to how I heard about you as well. You'd obviously been out diving with a few of my friends. I'd seen your name pop up a few times, and then we obviously became Facebook friends and started talking a little bit. And then, finally here we are actually meeting in person.
It's awesome, man. It's awesome. And soon we're going to get in the water, right? We're planning
for sure.
Hopefully next week and much more. So obviously this is Speaking Sidemount. So my first question to most of my guests and for you as well is, how did you first become involved in sidemount diving and why did you choose sidemount as a configuration for you? Well,
at the time that we actually started sidemount diving was we decided to start heading out and looking for new cave here in New Zealand, because at that stage there was only really 3 well-known cave dives. Mm-hmm. You had the Pierce Resurgence, which obviously the Wet Mules were diving at the time, and then there was Blue Creek, which GUE New Zealand had several projects running, and then there's Reewaka Resurgence, which was a series of sumps. And other than that, there wasn't really any cave dives that were well known. So we decided to actually start heading out and looking for some new virgin cave. And after finding a couple of small systems and little things here and there, it became very apparent very quickly that we had to start using sidemount configuration for a whole host of reasons. At that point in time, there wasn't really much on the way in terms of courses and stuff. So we were kind of self-taught to begin with. And
what year are we talking about here?
I'd have to look back. I'd say maybe 2013, 2014. Yeah. So, I mean, Steve
Definitely not much here, right?
No. Yeah. There was definitely stuff going on over in Florida and then Mexico as well, with Steve Bogarts coming out with the Razor 1 around about that time. Mm-hmm. But we'd never really seen anything side-mounty over here, apart from outside of, within the dry caving community, where there's a couple of divers there and they were using very rudimentary rigs.
Kind of the sump diving.
Yeah.
So looking at sidemount, I mean, how has it changed the way that you run expeditions and benefited the progress of your exploration in New Zealand? And also I know that you're doing some expeditions overseas as well.
Yeah, so we've found that side mounts helped in a whole host of ways. I mean, first of all, we're doing a lot of remote location stuff. So in some instances, we were walking up to about 20 kilometers at a time and trying to have one person carrying a twin set and then someone else carrying the gear just unfortunately wasn't working. So we found that with side mount, we could kind of divvy up the weight a little bit more.
Yep.
And it meant that we could reach more remote locations to actually go diving. And
just one point to point out, I mean, it's very different in New Zealand from Mexico or Florida or some of the other places where you drive up in your truck to a park bench, set yourself up, walk down a nice set of steps into a spring. And so, New Zealand, there's only 5 million people here, the country the size of Japan or the UK, and a lot of wilderness area, right?
Yeah, and even when you get into that wilderness, the hiking tracks and stuff, they don't stop right next to the cave. Yeah. You usually have to use whatever network of hiking tracks there are and try and get as close to the cave entrance as possible, or where you think a cave entrance might be. And then from there, you're usually bush bashing and running off topographic maps and looking around, running with GPS and stuff like that. So it's not straightforward, easy walking. Yeah. And every now and then you may have rappelling and stuff to do if you're actually in a cave itself. But we haven't come across too much of that in New Zealand so far.
Right. And I guess, so talking about New Zealand as well, the kind of mixture of dry caving and cave diving is really important in a lot of these.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. There's... The dry cavers have a lot of knowledge on the geology of New Zealand, and speaking to them and learning what to look out for geologically has meant that we can pinpoint more accurately where caves might be.
Yes.
And that's kind of refined our research kind of methodology. And so, because when we first started, we were kind of just winging it, and we were, going out looking for random pools. We didn't know if we were looking in, certain geologic areas where the bedrock may be limestone or marble, or in some cases we were diving in pumice. And after speaking to the dry cavers and having them kind of teach us a bit more about the geology of the caves in New Zealand, because it's very different to, say, Mexico or Florida, then after listening to them, we were able to refine our searches and make our expeditions and our reconnaissance missions a lot more productive and more fruitful.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that applies across the world. I was talking to Patrick Weidman on an episode actually that hasn't come out yet, but will be out when this one comes out. And he talked exactly the same thing. It's about, 50% of it is the pre-work that you do to establish where it might be a fruitful place to look. And he made a point as well that 90% of what they do is bashing through bush, jumping into sinkholes and finding nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the kind of thing which unfortunately puts quite a few people off, because quite often if you go out and you're only doing one dive every time you go out 10 times, then people aren't seeing as much reward as they would kind of hope. Yeah. But there's a few people out there that would obviously see that one dive as hard earned and appreciate it.
Once you find something that looks fruitful and starts to play out into a cave system, then you've got expeditions you can set up more purely diving along with the logistics, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So I'm really interested, obviously, being Kiwis is looking at, because it's not like other parts of the world, right, where there's a big cave diving community. There's really a very limited number of us in this country. And then there's even a more limited number like you who are, genuine cave explorers.
Yeah, when I first started out, there was a few cave divers it was basically the GUE crowd that were the Kiwis that were going out cave diving. And it was only really Blue Creek that was suited to that style of diving. Yeah. So there really wasn't anyone else about in the country other than a couple of dry cavers that were doing exploration dives in some of these sumps and stuff. A guy called Kieran McKay was probably, or is still probably the most prolific cave explorer in New Zealand. And he's probably done more diving than cave diving in New Zealand than anyone else. And other than that, there was myself and then a handful of other people that were looking to find new cave. And since then, the community seems to have grown quite a bit. And we actually set up with a compressor and a cache of tanks and a load of lead down in the South Island, because that's where most of the action was happening. Mm-hmm. But the majority of Kiwi cave divers were actually based up in Auckland. Mm-hmm. So by setting that up down there, it meant that we could actually fly down, and we had pretty much the majority of the heavy equipment already down there that you can't fly with. and we could literally just rock up with whatever equipment we needed that we could get on the plane, and then start going diving.
Yeah.
And a couple of the dry cavers, there's a guy called Neil Thorpe who's been heavily involved with the dry cavers. He's been kind enough to actually look after all of our equipment, and he moves it between 2 different locations in the South Island for us, which both have caves that we could dive in. So it's pretty fortunate now. You can go down, you can do a weekend trip, and you can get some good diving in.
So now it's open for people like me, thanks to the work that you've done, right? And you and others.
Yeah,
awesome.
Awesome. That's what we're working towards for sure.
Excellent. Hey, one thing that's crossed a lot of my recent podcasts has been the Thailand cave rescue and how famous Richard Harris or Harry and Craig Challen have become. And I know you do a lot of work with them, known as the Wet Mules, as their dive team. So tell us a bit about what you've been doing with them in New Zealand and further afield.
Well, I first met Craig and Harry and the rest of the Wet Mules when they came over to New Zealand to do a wreck diving project, of all things. And they came into the shop I was working at Global Dive, and they needed gas fills and a lot of kind of the logistical support. So we got all that ready for them, and they were looking for something slightly different to do than the Pierce Resurgence. So we mentioned that they should maybe come over to Blue Creek and see if they could find the way on in there, because it's kind of been walled out for quite a while now, and if anyone was going to be able to find new going passage and try and link that into Bulmer, it would have been these guys. Right. So they decided to take a year off from the Pierce and come over to Blue Creek, and Stefan Parsons, who's a good diving buddy, and myself, we joined them and showed them around a little bit, and then left them in Blue Creek to do the thing. And since then, we've always been in contact, seeing what projects we can help out with them, and then vice versa. And recently, I was actually in Canada and managed to find a really good group of people over there, the Dry Cavers, the Alberta Speleological Society. Yeah. And they were pointing me in the direction of lots and lots of fresh, virgin cave dives to do. And it became very quickly apparent that I was going to be out of my depth quite quickly in one of the systems, a system called Crow's Nest Spring. And I got in touch with Harry and said, "Oh, look, we've got this cave here. It looks like it's going deep. Would you be interested in coming over?" And of course, those guys jumped at the chance. And they're just absolutely amazing guys to work with. Very inspirational, and they've been nothing but supportive. So just truly great guys.
I haven't met Craig, but I've said a few times I've met Harry and Truck, and just had an awesome experience having conversations with him about diving. And he's the sort of guy you feel like you could sit there and talk for hours, right? And he'd share his experiences and knowledge. And he was helping me out with a bit on the Sidemount rebreathers, which we'll have a chat about in a moment too. So tell us some more about the Canada expeditions you were doing. So these are in Alberta. Talk a little bit about this one in particular with Craig and Harry.
Yeah, so I'd done a little bit of research before actually moving over to Canada, trying to see if there were actually caves over there. Because I remember someone actually saying before I moved to Canada that there were no caves. Right. Which I found very hard to believe. And that certainly wasn't the case when I got over there. The thing with Canada is there are lots of caves. There's just not very many people doing them.
Yes.
And through a little bit of research, there's a cave called Caves of the Canadian Rockies. And looking through there was this map on a cave system called Crow's Nest Spring. And it had been dived probably down to roughly about 60 meters or so. I wanted to, get in there and at least just see the cave for myself, not necessarily do any exploration. And if the exploration happened, then that was obviously a bonus. To begin with, I actually started out kayaking across the lake because you've got Crow's Nest Lake in front of the cave.
Let's talk temperatures for a minute too, because it interests me, Canada. This is summertime you're doing this?
Late summer. So in Canada, the cave systems flood during the summer, right? Because the snow melt and stuff like that. So the precipitation over there is very different to what we have here in New Zealand. A lot of the caves here, if it rains, you can't dive, whereas over there it's a lot more seasonal in that when the snow's melting, you can't dive. So the temperature of the cave, that one in particular is actually known as a warm cave because it's a semi-thermal spring, and that was 6 degrees. So that was the warmest cave we dived over there.
I said to you yesterday, you're talking to a guy who's only gone down to 8 degrees so far and found that pretty cold. So that must be interesting in itself.
Yeah, and that was probably my main limiting factor in terms of the exploration of Crow's Nest Spring. When Craig and Harry came over, they were definitely more thermally sound and obviously better prepared for that type of temperature of diving. So they managed to push on quite a way ahead, and it was just absolutely mind blowing what those guys managed to achieve.
You and I were talking yesterday about it. So from what I took from that, it went down to 65 meters, but then you had an ascent part of the cave.
Yeah, so it went down to roughly about 60 meters, and then kind of plateaued out for a little ways, and you come to the bottom of what's now been coined the water slide, because there's this big, beautiful, smooth limestone kind of ramp which just heads up to about 30 meters, and then it levels out again at 30 meters for a little ways, and then drops back down to 54 meters from memory. And as soon as you get down to 54 meters, you then have a second giant water slide, as it were, which heads all the way back up to the surface. And Craig
and you need to go that way to continue through the cave, right?
Yes, yeah. Well, Craig and Harry surfaced on the far side in a chamber with kind of going dry passage in it. It looks like a phreatic passage, but they noticed there was actually no water flow up the end. So we believe we may have missed something a little bit further back in the cave, because Craig said he picked the flow back up in that kind of 30-meter shallow section, like far into the cave. So
certainly might be better than doing the ascent inside the cave, right?
Yeah. When they said it looked like it was heading back up to the surface, I couldn't believe they were actually...
just for any listeners who are sort of new to this type of diving, I mean, obviously doing seesaw profiles is not something that you generally want to do anyhow, but the big challenge inside a cave too is if you have a problem with your ears. So you've done a descent to a certain depth, and then you ascend, and then you have to descend again to exit the cave. So can have big problems, right? Yeah, for sure. And the other issue you've got with those caves in Canada, and again, if you have an issue with your ears, you may have to stay in that shallow section for quite a while. And the longer you're in the water, obviously, the colder you're getting, and kind of the more it plays on you thermally. So it's they're all considerations that kind of have to come into play when you're doing these kinds of dives. I think it's pretty clear now that Sidemount CCR is a big interest of mine at the moment, and I know that you and I talked off mic a little bit about how it's made remote location and multiple dive exploration projects much more possible. So talk us through a little bit about, right from the very beginning, how did you get started in Sidemount CCR, and how are you using it now?
So it was kind of similar to how we got involved with Sidemount in the first place, in that it became a bit more of a necessity for us, in that because we're doing the remote location diving, we would be hauling tanks in over long hikes and then going for a dive, and then once you've burnt through your gas, then that's your dive over. And it quickly became apparent that if we were on a Sidemount closed-circuit rebreather, for the same amount of weight that we would have to carry into the dive, we could actually do multiple dives. So it's made logistics a little bit easier from that point of view, because it means we can be more productive when we're actually at the site. But then the other thing we've also found it to be very beneficial for is when you're setting up a cave, if you're, for instance, Blue Creek, if we go there, you have decompression to do when you're coming out, because it's like 60 meters deep. So what we can do with that is we can set the cave up with all of our bailout and decompression gases, and we can dive it for a week on end without touching those bailout gases if we don't have an issue. But they're obviously still there for safety. So with that in mind, we're not walking gas to and from the cave every single day, and having to fill every night as well. So it's just meant that even on projects that aren't quite such a long hike, we can set the cave up and we can do multiple dives and do more diving in the same time period as we would on open circuit. Yeah,
which is a big advantage, right? It's quite different to doing an open water deep dive on a rebreather where you pretty much need to carry your bailout with you, right? You can set it up, stage it, and then once it's in the water, it's in the water. You need it. If you don't, it stays there until you want to take it out, right?
Yeah. And well, actually, while we were in Canada, I can't imagine trying to dive some of the caves that we were doing on open circuit, because the closest place we would have to get, our tanks filled would have been Calgary, and we were in the middle of the Rockies, which is, it's a 3-hour drive one way, so you'd have a 6-hour drive round trip just to get gas filled.
Were you bringing a compressor in again?
Which unfortunately we didn't have that luxury, although the guys are looking at setting up with a compressor over there just to make logistics for them a little bit easier, because the dry cavers are actively pursuing courses down in Mexico, and I think they're actually doing stuff with Patrick Widman out of Protex. So they're gearing up to be more kind of sufficient with the diving side of things, because they've got some amazing projects that are possible over there.
It's just happening all over the world, and again, talking to Patrick, the thing that was lighting them up is, it's 2018 and we can still go to places on the planet that no human being has been before. And it's happening in every continent. They've got projects in the Dominican Republic and Mexico and Madagascar. Stuff happening. You're doing stuff in Canada. I'm still sure there's... Jill Heineth was saying that the most popular caves in Florida, Ginny Springs, is still being explored.
Yeah, I believe John Bernot was pushing something in there even as recently as 2015. Or that's the last I saw of it. There's probably something even more recent.
And then there's, of course, Europe and both Western and Eastern Europe. So, it's just an amazing time to be in diving and cave diving where this sort of exploration is possible. And, of course, we've got other things in terms of shipwrecks and all those sort of things available as well. So we're talking Sidemount Rebreather now. So what particular projects have Sidemount Rebreathers or CCR made possible? Give us a little bit about a couple of those perhaps.
So particularly over in Canada, obviously, as I said, the rebreathers really came into play there for, the logistical benefits of not having to run backwards and forwards to get gas. Blue Creek as well, as we said with that, just kind of helps us set up and do a week's worth of diving without hauling lots of gas. And one of the ones that kind of sticks out in my mind is a project that myself and Stephen Parsons did up in the Kahurangi National Park in New Zealand. And we were walking for probably about 20 kilometers into this site. And having the rebreather there meant that we could do multiple dives, again, with only the weight of what you would normally have for a single dive. And then we could also sit in the bush for a number of weeks. We were actually in there for 2 weeks on one particular expedition, and it meant that we weren't filling tanks, we weren't disturbing the bird life, and we could be a little bit more kind of courteous with our noise making. And it's the rebreather also gave us logistical benefits in terms of percolation, because the cave itself was very silty. It's a very fine kind of sediment that's in there, and you get these big silt banks. And then because there's a very slight flow that goes all the way through the cave, it's not very noticeable, but it does drag a lot of that silt around with it. And it deposits up on ledges and against the ceiling and stuff like that. So with the rebreather, it meant we didn't have as many bubbles, so we didn't have as much percolation, which meant our exit visibility was a lot better. And also we would have more time in certain areas where we were looking for leads. Rather than if we were on open circuit, we would have been exhaling a lot of exhaust bubbles, and they would have been dislodging all the sediment that was on the ceiling, meaning that we only had 10 seconds before we lost visibility looking for leads. Whereas with the rebreather, we could sit there for quite a while. And
So there's a practical side to the project at hand, finding leads and making that as successful as possible. And I guess there's a comfort thing as well. I mean, there's nothing like having good visibility versus bad, right?
Yeah, and the other thing with that cave as well, there was a section which was very low and very wide, and there was quite a lot of instability in the actual roof itself, the roof material. And while we were swimming through that area, the floor is just this very, very fine silt. And it didn't matter how delicate you were with finning techniques. And again, I'll show you a video in a little bit of swimming through there, and you'll see this frog kick is miles off the bottom, but clouds are just still wafting up. Like, it's very fine silt. Even through that section, you're coming back in zero viz, basically. And having the rebreather there as well meant that you knew you had time. You could, really take your time handling the line, because there were no tie-offs in the cave. So we were using silt pegs to hold everything in, which is obviously a little bit nerve-wracking in zero visibility, because if you accidentally pull one out, you could pull the line into a line trap, or the line will go slack. You'd have to deal with that situation. But with the rebreather, it meant that we could really take our time going through there, be as gentle as possible, follow the line, we're barely touching it, but still be completely relaxed. And
the percolation aspect actually applies to wreck diving as well. I've been doing some projects on the Canterbury trying to copy some of Pete Mesley's lighting techniques in the boiler room, and I've been able to set the lights up, but by the time I spin back around to actually take some images of that or some video, percolation from the rust, this is a 10-year-old wreck now, but it really just destroys the shot. Same in the engine room. And then if we talk to Mikhail Lermontov, very famous wreck in the Marlborough Sounds in the South Island, that's been there since the mid-80s. There's parts of that you simply can't dive to.
Yeah, correct. I mean, if you look through the Leningrad restaurant, you look at some of the old pictures of it, and they have these like rusticles, I think they call them, that are just hanging from the ceilings, which kind of look almost like dreadlocks.
Yeah.
And if an open circuit diver passed underneath there, it would be...
Actually, one that comes to mind, and I keep saying it was a truck lagoon this year, man, it was one of the trips of a lifetime for sure. But we're diving in the San Francisco Maru, and there's a part of that you go underneath, and there's mines above you. And in Pete's words, they're held on by a seahorse ship, and so in open circuit, I was holding my breath going underneath there, swimming through to make sure that bubbles didn't go up and just, potentially dislodge a mine, I guess. So I want to pick your brains a bit now because I've spoken so far, where did I start? Steve Bogart's on the Liberty and with Jill Heineth as well.
Yep.
Dive Soft Liberty, rebreather. Chatted to Gary Dallas about the SF2, which I'm quite enamored with. I like the unit. Seems like it's really well engineered, but it's a lot of that's around Gary and the Sidemount skill set that he brings to that and the way that he's setting it up, which I think is important as well. And then I spoke to Brian Kaycock about the KISS Sidekick, which I think is what you dive as well.
Correct, yeah.
And he was the one person to say, this is the perfect unit for what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I found that interesting,
We've definitely found that the Sidekick is pretty much the perfect unit for what we're doing as well. I mean, obviously, other people will have differences in what works for them, but for us, we settled on the KISS Sidekick because, again, coming back to the remote location type of diving, we can service everything in the field.
Yes.
So probably the most complicated part of the unit or to service is, for me, I don't know much about electronics, so it's the cable, and they're very easy to change. It's basically just one gland. You can take the Molex connectors off, and so if you snap a cable for any reason, we carry a spare. We can retrofit that in the field and then carry on diving, and then everything else is fully mechanical. So it means that we carry the spares kit for the manual ad valves, the rebreather itself, and we can usually get ourselves out of any problem we might have in the field with not necessarily a bush fix, but a proper service actually on the unit. And it actually requires minimal tools to pull the whole unit apart and strip it down. I'm not saying go out and strip down your own KISS Sidekick if you don't have any experience as a service technician. But I've worked as a technician for almost 10 years. So obviously, quite happy working with regulators and compressors and rebreathers and stuff like that. So it's definitely probably the most beneficial thing we've found with the Sidekick is you can beat it up and it can actually take...
A little more bulletproof, right? Is it a more simple system compared to some of the others?
I would say so, yeah. In terms of the fact that it's completely manual to begin with, so you don't have any solenoids that could potentially stick open, and you don't have a handset that's controlling the unit. So again, if for instance,
controlling your PO2 manually,
correct, and because most of the stuff we're doing is shallow, but the rebreather is giving us the logistical advantages, we're not quite so concerned with the PO2 in terms of racking on decompression. So we can kind of play around with that a little bit, and I think Steve Bogart's actually put up a very good post a while ago when he was diving on the Liberty, what he was doing with his PO2 in shallower caves and how it kind of helped him with buoyancy and stuff like that. So we found that works really well with the... What
are you setting it at, or what are you trying to drive it to?
It really depends what depth we're at. Obviously, if we're working at depth or we're doing slightly deeper caves where we're going to be racking up decompression, we'll probably be running more like 1.3 set point. Whereas if we're in shallows, I'd say maybe take it down to your 0.7.
0.7 to 1 sort of thing, which gives you a much greater margin of safety. Is that the...
Well, it doesn't, because obviously you're closer to the lower side of things.
If you go too low, you've got problems too, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, you're not pumping the unit up with O2, so you're not having to constantly kind of maintain it. And you can actually, when you're in the shallows, as long as you're keeping an eye on your PO2, we've found that you can kind of let it fluctuate a little bit. So you could go slightly higher than 1.7, but we would tend to try and not go lower than that.
1.7 or 0.7?
Oh, sorry, 0.7. 0.7, yeah. And that's just kind of helped because it means that you can kind of focus more on the cave itself than constantly be looking at your wrist. And
I noticed this in truck. I won't name units, but there was almost every day someone had an issue, right? And this has been the standing kind of joke between open circuit and rebreather is, open circuit, you have an issue, immediately you can solve it underwater and you can fix it when you get out. Whereas with a rebreather, you have an issue, maybe you don't get to dive that day. And especially when you're away on a trip like that, trip of a lifetime almost, you
Yeah.
want to be diving, right?
Yeah. And again, that's where the simplicity of the kit comes in, because if you're we mentioned with a remote location, but even if you're away on holiday, you carry the same spares kit with you. You have an issue over there, you might miss the dive, but you can usually fix it and get back in either on the same day or the next day, so you don't miss too much diving.
Okay, so big advantage. Now, the other thing that's really important to me in terms of being a side mount diver is I dive and trim. Let's talk a little bit about worker breathing, and especially in different orientations. So by that I mean, head up, head down, one side on the other side. How does it dive in terms of being able to do that?
Pretty much every side mount rebreather I've ever dived has had its limitations with worker breathing. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things you kind of have to accept when you get them, and they definitely tell you if your trim's off. If you go kind of feet down, then all the gas kind of rushes to your cheeks and you get like chipmunk cheeks. And then obviously if you go heads down, then it goes the other way and it starts trying to
So it's actually better to be in trim, right?
Much better to be in trim. Yeah. Now, for us in caves, obviously, sometimes you have to go a little bit head up or head down to go through, if you're going over a boulder pile or a breakdown section or something like that. But it's the kind of thing that you can get used to and you can learn to anticipate as well. The units, the side mount units, I certainly wouldn't be doing any extreme deep diving on them just yet until the worker breathing kind of becomes a little bit better as technology advances. Yeah. But
Brian spoke about something on that. He was saying that they had added something to the system that enabled them to do deeper dives now, so that limitation was gone.
So Harry actually had, it was needle valve that was the upgrade, and Harry actually had one that Mike sent to him when we were in Canada.
Right.
So he was trialing one of those units as well, and it's that's more revolving around your PO2 as opposed to the worker breathing. But every rebreather is going to have its limitations. It's good for certain things, but not for others. For me, I find the Sidekick is a generally good, rounded unit. It is capable of doing deep dives as well, but you might want to think about something with a little bit better hydrostatic worker breathing, as it were.
Tell me about wearing it. The other thing is, can you align the rebreather itself to your body? How long is it relative to a 80 cubic foot aluminium cylinder or 11 litre, as we would say?
So the Sidekick itself, it's actually a beautiful size, and it's pretty much the diameter of an 80 cubic foot tank. The length of it is actually a fair bit shorter. It's a very compact size, it's very portable, and as far as wearing it goes, it's pretty easy to set up, really. It does obviously take a little bit of fine-tuning when you first get one, as pretty much any rebreather will have. For me, it was very quick to kind of jump on it and go, because my instructor, Grant Pierce, who did my crossover onto the unit, he had, I think, a little bit to do with the development in the early years of it. So he obviously knew the unit really well and knew how to set it up, and he pretty much showed me, and it was just, we were in the water and it was trimmed out and we were away.
It's a wonderful feeling, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole side mount thing anyhow. I mean, I had a course a couple of weeks ago and I put my 2 students in the water, and I think the thing that shocked them on day one is how good they were. I'd like to take credit for that, and I will take some.
Yeah.
Because I prepared them out of the water, but boy, they got in the water, and just that pro trim effect of having the cylinders on your sides. And I was really proud of them on the first day, seeing them. Experienced divers, I'm not teaching newbies here, but at the same time, I was really pleased to see that response from them.
Yeah, that's obviously the sign of those guys also learning from someone who's got experience rather than being self-taught. I mean, like personally did in the beginning, because unfortunately there wasn't much around, but I think there's enough good instructors and good courses out there at the moment that a lot of people looking to get into side mount diving now can bypass that whole learning curve by learning from someone super experienced and just being able to...
Yeah, you and I were talking offline. I was reading a forum the other day. There was a big discussion around somebody who was self-taught. And look, good on them. I have no problem with somebody teaching themselves. There was a time when you had to, as you say, and Steve Bogart's talked about that too in our interview, and certainly all the pioneers, all the modern day pioneers of side mount diving. When I say modern day, I'm sort of talking from 2005 through to where we are now, where we've gone through the explosion. A lot of the early pioneers of that did have to teach themselves, because it was only the CDG, sump and cave divers, those guys, and a few others in Europe, and just a few people in the States who were really side mount diving. So that was that time, and I think we live in a different time now where, depending on what you want to do, I think if you love the idea of tinkering and teaching yourself things. I'd liken it to drumming, right? I learned to play the drums and I did not take a lesson. I was super proud of it, but I'm a shit drummer. And when I say shit, it's kind of, I can play, I'm not a really good drummer. And then you contrast with someone like Dave Grohl of the Foo Fighters, who taught himself to drum, but practiced for 10 hours a day every day, and that's all he ever did. He's one of the world's best, so you can teach yourself. But then you can also go to a top music school and learn to play drums and accelerate your time to proficiency. So bringing that back to diving, if your goal is to become a really good diver, especially in Sidemount, then why wouldn't you do a course if your goal is more, hey, to figure it out for yourself, because that gives you some sort of positive benefit. Then there's nothing wrong with that either. Horses for courses, eh? We were just talking off mic a little bit about sump diving versus cave diving versus side mount. And one of the things that I discussed with Jill Heineth in that episode was the difference between what a side mount instructor is aspiring to, which is to optimize both yourself and your student and to get them set up in the best possible manner. And you're being really strict on trim, and yes, you're being pedantic about the length of hoses and bungees and so on. And we contrast that with an explorer, and in particular a sump diver, who is basically trying to make something work in the field in a pretty interesting environment where sometimes it's hard to make things perfect.
Yeah. I mean, on some of these forums that you see, and like a lot of equipment's being criticized because, a hose is the wrong length or something like that. I'm sure there would be pictures of me at some stage that would come out that would be absolutely torn to shreds on there. And that's mainly because when you're doing the exploration side of things, sometimes we have to just work with what we've got.
Yeah.
What's at hand, the dive shop might not have the perfect length hose. They might have something a little bit longer or a little bit too short. So you've just kind of got to work with what's available. And it's if you can get that perfect equipment and that kind of perfect trim and stuff on your cylinders, then that's obviously going to help you in the water, and you would aspire to have that. But the reality is, if we don't have that and we have a certain amount of equipment with us that's, not necessarily the prettiest equipment, but will still get us in the water and able to explore, then it's a choice of, do you want to look good or do you want to go diving?
Yeah. I think we draw a line too. There's the element of safety, right? So
for
we're
sure.
not talking about doing something unsafe. We're not talking about not being streamlined. We're not talking about having entanglement hazards in our equipment, right?
Yeah, correct. We're talking about if the harness you've got maybe has one low profile D-ring and then the opposite side's a normal D-ring or something like that. Ideally you would want both of those D-rings to be the same, but the reality is you're not going to skip your dive just because...
Especially, I guess, if something breaks as well. This is really part of it. Patrick talked about, on the interview I had with him, about breaking the rubber D-rings that he has on the X-Step Stealth, and a lot of people remove them, but he has a very specific reason for having it, which is he doesn't like metal contacts on his equipment. So good reason, I buy that. So, but they can break. And so then you've got to be able to say, I just broke one, what am I going to do now? And
maybe a little loop of bungee or something like that.
You clip it back onto the D-ring at the back, right? And now your cylinder's out of line, but you can finish your dive.
Now, I would just like to say as well, obviously we would go and do these dives on equipment that's, I wouldn't say substandard, but not optimal. The one thing we do try and make sure of is that we are definitely aware of that when we're going into the water. So, for instance, if we're going into a cave and we know our equipment isn't 100% perfect, then first of all, like you said, we're not going to be doing anything dangerous, but also we're not going to be doing anything that's going to damage the cave. So, if our tanks aren't actually, 100% in trim because we only had a certain length of cord that we could use to jerry rig something up, we would make sure that obviously we were aware of that. And if we were going through a restriction, we would kind of be pulling that tank, which wasn't quite perfectly trimmed, down into a position where it's not going to be, damaging the silt or damaging the roof or the walls or anything.
We're not talking about going into Dan's cave here too, Brian, if you're listening. So that's the sort of thing where you have your equipment set up and you've got to be absolutely right, because some of the formations, you talk about stalactites and stalagmites, they can take tens of thousands of years to form,
sure,
right?
Yeah.
So this is very much the exploration side as opposed to I can walk to a nice sinkhole and also not and be into the cave straight away, right?
Yeah, and once again, if you can have that perfect equipment when you're doing these exploration dives, then that's what you do. That's what you do, yeah.
Well, Tom, thank you. It's been awesome catching up. In fact, it's been emotional after all of this time. Tom and I have spent a couple of days or a few hours over the last 2 days talking with each other and sharing stories, and it's been really interesting to hear about what you've been doing in New Zealand in particular. It's great to expose that, I think, to the rest of the world. It's also been really good to listen to what you've been doing in Canada and other parts of the world, and some of the people you've been diving with, Harry and Craig and so on. So what have you got planned for the rest of this year?
For the rest of this year, we're looking at doing some more projects down in the South Island. We've got Craig and Harry are looking to come over, and we'll get some stuff kicked off down there with those guys. And then after that, I'll actually be heading over to the West Coast with Mike Beatty. And we'll be spending about a month over there and pushing some new leads, hopefully, surveying some old stuff, and just generally having an absolute ball.
Yeah.
And no doubt Kieran McKay and Bruce Clulo will come out and help out with some of those, and hopefully we can help with some of their projects as well, because they're doing some really exciting stuff kind of in the Takaka Valley area. So, yeah, we've got that in the pipeline for summer, and then after that, who knows where the next adventure is going to be. I'm sure we'll find something soon.
Need to point one thing out, you missed one name.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We'll have to get you down there as well, Steve.
Thank you. So, yeah, I look forward to that, and that'll be an exciting adjunct to my plans for next year. So, yeah, really look forward to that. Yeah. So, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. It'd be great to get you down there.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.